This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
And I was just trying to contemplate what to do, and finally, I'd been going to all the missionary classes, and I did the thing that they taught us to do. I knelt down on the floor, and I grabbed my 810 drive, and I prayed that God would fix my drive.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Bryan Talbot published one program for the Atari computer, Cartoonist, which was published by Atari Program Exchange. It first appeared in the fall 1983 APX catalog, where it was awarded first prize in the Systems and Telecommunications category. I'm going to read its entry from the catalog. Cartoonist by Bryan Talbot. Recommended for ages 8 and up, written in BASIC and machine language. Create and animate your own cartoon characters. Ever had a secret desire to make your own movie? With Cartoonist, you use your Atari home computer to create your own characters and put them into motion. To create a frame, use your joystick controller to draw a character on the screen, modifying its height, width, or color, or create its mirror image. After you create your first frame, create more frames for your movie. You can insert frames, copy them, exchange different ones, or delete the ones that don't fit. When you've created all the frames, you're ready to animate them. To animate the movie, you run one frame after another and the motion begins. Your character can walk, hop, slink, slither, even fly. You can set the sensitivity of the joystick and vary the speed of the animation. You can save and recall films you've made. Programmers can use Cartoonist to add animated sequences to their programs. A how-to demonstration is included. But it's so versatile that children can develop their creativity by learning to make their own cartoons. You can choose options and activities from the program's many menus. To show you what Cartoonist can do, run one of the program's several short animated sequences. Review comments. Cartoonist is one of the best designed animation packages we've seen. The program's menu-driven approach makes it easy to master quickly. Requires Atari Basic Language cartridge, one Atari joystick controller. Optional, one set of Atari paddle controllers. Order information. It was available on diskette. It required 32K of RAM. It cost $24.95. It was APX catalog number 20237. This interview took place on December 8, 2017.
I think my first exposure to a computer was maybe when I was like 6 or 7 years old. I grew up in Castle Rock, Colorado, and my father, George Talbot, worked at a AAA auto club in Denver. And one day for my birthday, he took me up to spend the day with him, and they had this giant computer room with huge machines and punch cards flying all over, and I had no idea what it was, but I remember seeing that thing, and it didn't make much of an impression, but I remember it. And later we moved, my family, when I was about 8 or 9, moved back to Provo, Utah, and I was kind of a trouble kid in 4th grade, and so my teacher found a way to get rid of me once a week, and that was to put me in a little group of people that they would send down to the local university, and we would go visit, and they would show us stuff. They showed us glass blowing and things like that, but they took us to the computer room one time and took us around and showed us, again, these were giant computers, and the main thing I remember is they had these big air vents, and they had a couple of paper plates they had glued together, and they were floating in midair. And then they had this 132-column printer that they had designed a special printout for, that when they would print this thing at high speed, it would play Anchors Away. The print heads would play Anchors Away, and this paper's just rolling through playing Anchors Away. And that kind of made an impression on me as being cool to just print and play music like that. But, then a few years passed, and I didn't really think too much about computers. One time we had a little scout activity and went over to the physics department, and the guy was trying to show us how to make a football game on some kind of high-resolution graphics display, and I didn't get too excited about that. But then when I was like in middle school, suddenly the Atari VCS. No, I went over to my friend's house, and he had a Pong game. he was playing Pong, and I was really interested in that. And then the next year, the VCS came out, and all of a sudden, computers kind of had my attention. So that was kind of how I came into it. In fact, we played combat. I had a lot of little brothers, and we'd play combat and slot racers. And it got to the point where my parents had to hide the power adapter, and it was my job every day to see if I could find that and sneak in some game time and then sneak it back before they found out. So
nice.
I was really interested in the VCS, and I used to stop by the arcades every once in a while. They have these arcades with these games, but again, these were just playing games. But my real exposure, I guess, to computers was in my freshman year of high school. I went to Timpview High School in Provo, and I had the great fortune to have probably the best electronics teacher in the country. His name was Vern Bangeter, and he had this electronics lab that was just fabulous. He had electronics. He had a ham radio station. We could build our own circuit boards there. He had computers and stuff, and he had a little terminal that connected to the district office. That they had this little game on it that you could play. It was called Safecracker or something. It was a text-based game, but I think the thing that really got me interested in programming was this very bad implementation of a risk-like game where you're playing this war. You've got the battalions of tanks and ships and stuff, and you're playing the computer, and it's got all these things. And the algorithm was really bad, but it favored the underdog. And so whoever had the smaller army would tend to do bigger damage to whoever had the bigger army. And this is kind of true in real life. I saw a movie recently. It was called Jadaville. It's a true story in Africa. And you have this really small group of guys from, I think it was Norway or somewhere, and they held off a huge number of attacking, locals, like thousands for days. So it's true in real life that sometimes a small army could hold off a big army. But I was taking this electronics class, and we kind of stay after school and play this war game. And my cousin is named Gary Wolfenstein, and the guy was a genius because we were always losing. And suddenly he found the amazing power of fractions, because it turns out that this program didn't do very good checking. When you would send a number of tanks into battle, or you'd send ships into battle. Mm-hmm. It would say, how many do you have? It would check how many do you want to send, and it would have some number that you had, but it wouldn't check that the number that you were sending in was an integer. And so one day he got in a tight spot where he had almost nothing left, a couple of tanks, and he's fighting a battalion of like a couple hundred tanks, and he sent in 0.2 tanks, and those 0.2 tanks did a huge amount of damage to the enemy side, And we just spent the evening just laughing and hooting and hollering as we imagined. When it was planes, we were sending in propeller parts. When it was ships, we were throwing life preservers. And you wouldn't do a lot of damage, but you did enough damage that if you kept at it, the power of fractions was you could wear the enemy down, a little bit at a time. And I think at that point it kind of dawned on me that there was this underlying logic, and this logic could be good or it could be bad, but most of all, it was fun. It was fun mm-hmm. to figure out what was wrong with it and do things with it. And we just spent evenings just, the text was bad, the game was bad, but the imagination we could put into, throwing a couple of shoelaces at a whole, infantry division and, wiping some of them out was just hilarious. We were just laughing all evening long. And that went on for a couple of days, and then he discovered the power of negative numbers, which was even better, because not only did the thing not do integer conversions, it only checked to see that the number that you sent in was less than the number that you had. But it didn't do a lower bounds conversion. So if you were down to 10 guys, if you sent in negative million guys, those negative fighters weren't very good. They do very little damage. But then it would subtract negative 1,000,000 from the number of people you had, and suddenly you had a 1,000,000-strong army. It was fantastic, because then you always won. And so that was really fun for about a day, but then it made the game not fun at all, because you could always win. But at that point, I realized that there was underlying logic. There was underlying algorithms in here, and they could be fun, and you could change them, and you could do things with them, and I just didn't know what it was. I didn't know anything about it, but I knew there was something in there that could be fun. And Mr. Bangeter, he had It was a SWTPC, Southwest Technical Products. It was 6800 based, and later he got a 6809 based. He had a thing with dual floppy drives, multi-user. I mean, it was, that's what it was. It was all characters. But the next year, I came into high school. I was coming in as a sophomore. It was about 1979. And I'll never forget it. I walked in, and I walked by this room that was a different room. It was where they had a computer lab, and they had the most amazing looking machines, and they were Commodore PETs. They looked like something out of Star Wars. They had these triangular heads and little teeny keyboards, and you could type your program into them. You turn on, there's a prompt that said ready, and they had little cassette drives. But I went and sat down, and I didn't know any basic, but I think I knew print. And I typed in, 10, or I typed in print Bryan, because that's what everybody does, hello Bryan or something.
Sure.
You put your own name in. And I did that, and it did that. And then I made a little program and had it printed out and did a go-to-10, and it's like printing out my name, and it's like, whoa, this thing does what I say, and it never gets bored, And I immediately just got sucked into that thing. That was just fabulous. I was trying to learn everything I could about it, and instead of hanging in an electronics lab, I started hanging out in the computer lab with these Commodore PETs and these tape drives, and my cousin Gary, he'd hang out too, and we didn't know much, but one day he showed up, and he had this book. He had this David All More Basic Computer Games book that had 84 computer games. It was a green book, and it had these programs and it had these cartoons in it. And I didn't know what it meant, but all I knew is if you typed it in, you could run that game. And so all of a sudden, I had a path to being a programmer, and so that's what I did. That's how I learned programming, was just typing in those games, and he'd type them in, and I'd type them in, and it would always seem like it was going to be the most exciting game, and it always was up until the point that I got it typed in, and then I played a few times, and then something else was more exciting, and that one wasn't exciting anymore. But I went and got that book, and then I got the 101 games, the original book, and just devoured those things. I was just going through all the games and typing them in. These were all text-based games. There was nothing to it. But the thing I liked about the PET was it had these little character graphics. It had a character set where you had these funny things, and we started trying to make games, and none of us knew what we were doing, but we were trying it out. And they eventually got a TRS-80 in there, and I started thinking, I need to get a computer. I want something. And about that time, my father, he worked at the local university. He worked at BYU, and he was an accountant for one of their youth programs. And he said, "Listen, I've got this Apple II here, and we're always trying to run these summer programs, and we have to make some decisions about whether they can include people in these things or not, and we need something that can help us." Make the decisions whether to run or drop a program. He says, maybe you can help me program something. So he gave me this opportunity to go over there, and I wrote this program on this Apple II, and, they didn't have spreadsheets in those days, but it would basically take a couple of numbers, and here's how many you're in, and here's how much it costs, and it would tell you, yeah, you should run this, or no, you shouldn't. But so I had exposure to an Apple II, I had exposure to a SWTPC, I had exposure to a TRS-80 and a PET, and I said, boy, I really want a computer. And I started reading creative computing and compute stuff, and suddenly I became aware that there was this thing called an Atari 800. I had a VCS at home and played games, but suddenly I was aware that there was this thing called an Atari 800 that it had the character set like the PET, and it had BASIC on it, but it could do high-res graphics like the Apple II, and it could play games like the VCS, and I wanted to get one, and so I started trying to scheme about how I would get myself an Atari 800, and they were a lot of money in those days. They weren't cheap. It was $1,000, $1,300 for an Atari, and I had to figure that out, and so. I needed to get a job, so the fact that I needed an Atari 800 kind of motivated me to see if I could get a job. And I started looking around. I did a paper route as a kid, but that didn't pay very well. Yeah. And so my father, I had a lot of brothers and sisters. I had there's 9 of us all together, and so he worked at the university, but he picked up a part-time job at this place called Mega Diamond Industries, and he was an accountant for them part-time. He'd spend, maybe 10 hours a week or whatever, but, he knew these people down there. And I didn't really know the story behind the place until later, but what they were is this was a place that manufactured industrial diamonds. And not only that, it was one of only 2 places in the world that did it.
For cutting machines and that sort of thing.
Yeah, for drill bits, dentist drills. For if oil, if they got these oil rigs, they got these steel carbide drills. Well, they coat them with diamond dust. And it used to be that they would have to all the good diamonds they'd turn into to engagement rings, and then all the bad diamonds they'd grind up and put them on drills. Well, there was this guy named Tracy Hall. In about 1954, he was working for General Electric, and he was working with high pressure, high temperature physics. And one day he came into the lab and discovered when he looked that he had little teeny diamonds in there. He had his pressure and his temperature so high that he actually made diamonds. So he got really excited. He went and told the management, "Hey, I discovered how to make diamonds. This is the first time it had ever been done." And they said, "Wow, good job." And they gave him this is according to stories I've read. I haven't read deeply, but he had a big website. But apparently they gave him a $10 savings bond.
Wow.
And so he said, well, over time, he said, well, if you're going to do that, I'm just going to go start my own diamond factory. So he left GE and he went to Provo and he started this diamond factory and he called it Mega Diamond. And that's this place that my dad worked. So my dad found out that they needed a programmer. And so he said, well, my son's learning some stuff. Why don't you talk to him? So they had me come down for an interview. I was like, rising junior in high school, and they interviewed me and they gave me a job. And so, I was making $3.50 an hour. That was minimum wage. I'd never had a job before except this experience writing this Apple II thing. And so they gave me a key to the building and they said, here's where you're going to work. And they took me in. And the machine they had was just the most amazing machine. It was a Tektronix 4052 high-resolution graphics workstation. And that thing had there wasn't very many of them. They were really expensive. But it had a vector display. There were no pixels. When you drew a line diagonally, it was just straight. And it was a phosphor screen. So once you put a character on the screen, it couldn't disappear unless you cleared the whole screen. But it ran BASIC. And so they put me to work writing some inventory software for them. They needed to keep track of all the diamonds they were making. And I was just entranced by that thing. I mean, that was the only thing I cared about. I didn't care about all the diamonds they had. I didn't care, they might as well have been the municipal, sewage treatment plant. I didn't care. They had a Tektronix 4052, And so I'd go down there and I'd work on this program and for them, inventory. And I'm earning up my money so I can get the Atari 800. And they had this Tektronix had a couple of games on it that they had a game tape that I couldn't get access to, but I saw them one time. They had an artillery game that would draw some landscape and you'd shoot cannons at each other. And then they had a little lunar lander game. And so I knew that it had these high-res graphics. So I'm working away and had the strangest problem I think I've ever seen in retrospect. But this thing had a cartridge tape drive. It was a little 1/4-inch cartridge tape drive. And it was like it was like the 410 cassette tape drive, except it was faster and bigger. It was more like a VHS tape size thing, and it could fast forward and fast backward. But that's where all the data went to. When you save your programs. And so over time, these tapes just kept dying, and they kept dying, and we'd replace them with different tapes, and I'd copy all my data over, and the next tape would die. And so we started buying better tapes from 3M, and those would die. And this was getting to be a problem because if I lost all my data and I lost my program, then I didn't have a job and I couldn't get an Atari. So it was a really bad deal, And so I started getting concerned. And after we went through about 6 or 7 tapes, I was working with a guy named Gary Peterson. He was a PhD. He was a chemist. And I said, Gary, these tapes, they just keep dying. What do you think it is? And he said, he says, I got an idea. And he says, I'm going to look at these tapes under a microscope. And so he takes it off for a couple of days, and I come back the next time. I was only working like 10 hours a week, and he had a big smile, and he goes, I think I figured it out. And I said, well, what is it? What, these bad tape brand, or what's the deal? And he goes, no, it's all these diamonds. And it turns out, and I was totally oblivious to this, but they were having me do all my work in the diamond sorting room. So the way this thing worked, the way this company worked, is they had these giant tetrahedral presses made out of big steel tetrahedral contraptions that would push these 4 carbide steel anvils together. They would have 10,000 tons of pressure, 20,000 tons of pressure, and I mean tons, not pounds. Huge amount of pressure, and they put these little carbon cubes in there and heat them up, and high pressure, and a few days later they'd let them go, and there'd be diamonds inside, and so they'd diamond dust, kind of green diamond dust. And so what they'd do is they'd scoop up all the diamond dust, and then they'd take it to the diamond sorting room, which was the room that I worked in, and they had this table. It was like a ping pong table made out of stainless steel that was cut in half diagonally and propped up on its side. And they had a little hopper in the top, and they would pour diamond dust in this hopper, and then the diamond dust would flow out, kind of like an hourglass, the little grains of sand. Mm-hmm. And they would electrostatically charge it, or magnetically. I can't remember if it was magnetic or electrostatic, but they would charge it somehow, and then vibrate the table. So there was this waterfall of diamonds, or diamond falls. It's just this flow of diamonds down the table, and the big ones would go to one side, and the little ones would go to the other side, and they'd have these little hoppers all the way along the table, and it would sort them by all the different sizes. And the ones on one side would go into dentist drill bits, and the ones on the other side would go into, to rock core machines for the oil companies. So this thing was just usually running or often running. So I'm like in the only room in the world that has a diamond waterfall running. And I'm totally oblivious to it because I've got a Tektronix 4052, right? High-resolution graphic workstation, so I didn't care what it was, but this thing's running. But the table is vibrating, and what was going on is the diamonds are bouncing off the table, especially the small ones, and they're getting into the air, and the air conditioner's running, and they're circulating, and they're coming into the fan in the back of the computer and going all over the motherboard, and then they're going past the read head on the tape drive, and they're saying, hey, that's magnetic, let's go live over there, So they get on the read head, and then the tape comes running by, and it says, hey, there's magnetic tape, let's jump on there. And so the tape itself was acting like it was attracting all the diamond dust, and then acting like sandpaper, and it's sanding down the read head, and then the read head is accumulating all this diamond dust and ripping the magnetic media off the tapes. That's what was going on. We had a stinking diamond infestation on the tape drive.
Wow.
Okay. And so I didn't know all this because I didn't really pay attention to their process. I just thought it was the brand of tapes we were buying. But Gary Peterson, he figured it out, and he goes, no, it's these stinking diamonds, and we got to fix this problem. And so he went and put the sponge on the input fan, and and I had to filter out the diamond dust, and then eventually they moved me and the computer into some other room. But it was like the most unusual problem in the world. Nobody would have ever figured that out. You're not going to call up 3M and they're going to say, hey, do you think it's the diamonds? There was no other place in the world that had that. And so it was just a funny thing when I think back of that. It's kind of this nerdy thing. I imagine these nerdy guys, a cartoon with these nerdy guys standing amidst piles of diamonds, and by the way, whenever they'd do newspaper interviews every once in a while, and they'd send somebody out and back, and they'd get a big pile of diamonds and dump them on the table, and take a newspaper picture, and there's huge piles of diamonds on the table. So these nerds standing in piles of diamonds, and one nerd says, hey, Talbot, I think I figured it out. And Talbot says, what? It's these stinking diamonds. They're infecting our tape drive. That's why we're losing all our data. And anyway, that was the problem. So anyway, he solved that problem. They moved me to another room. And so I wrote their inventory for them, and then they eventually got some Apple IIIs, and I wrote their payroll for them, and I wrote their what else did I do? I did financial analytics for them, and eventually I got enough money to buy an Atari 800 at the Diamond Factory. So that was kind of a cool experience to work there, and
nice.
So I eventually got my Atari 800. My father said, if you earn half the money, I'll match you. So about July 26, 1981 is when I called up a mail order company and ordered my Atari 800. And so the thing shows up. I'm all excited.
I need to know why you remember that date so specifically.
Well, first I have the invoice, and second, It turned out years later that is my wedding anniversary, and so so it turned out that I bought my Atari, a few years before I got married. But yeah, I exactly remember the date now.
Nice.
But yeah, I do have the original invoice. I was so excited about the thing, and so I set out to. And I was excited about the player missile graphics and the color and everything. I mean, it was just fantastic. And so the first thing I did is I said, I'm going to write that cannon game, the artillery game they have on the Tech 4052. And try and duplicate that. And so I did. I'd draw little cannons and you could shoot, and it made little sounds and stuff. And that reminds me, one thing about the 4052, I forgot to mention, that was a very influential computer on my Atari experience, because the 4052 had a very interesting feature. I mean, it had this high-resolution graphics display, but there was no mouse, there was no anything. But it had these menu buttons. It had these 20 menu buttons that were up in the upper left-hand corner. And when you would hit one of those menu buttons, it would generate a go-to to a particular number. And then the line numbers 10 through 100 were reserved. And so if you hit the first button, it went to 10, and if you hit the next button, it went to 15, and so on. And it would generate these go-tos. And so if you wanted to make a program, you would take a little piece of plastic and you would write your menu functions on there, slap it on there, and then put your go-to vectors in the right spot, and you hit buttons, and that's your menu, and you could use this program. And so all the programs were written that way, because it had this little funky menu system, which I've never seen anywhere else. And so I wrote my Canon program, and then I started experimenting with the joystick. And like everybody else, the first thing I found was the Atari joystick, put out all these funny numbers. And if you wanted to make any kind of decent game, you always had to turn whatever number it put out when you called the stick command into an X and a Y value. And so you had all these if statements, if it's 9, it's X is this and Y is this, and if it's 10, X is this and Y is that. And you had all these if statements. And by the time you got through all the if statements, Atari Basic was really slow, as everybody knows, because it does binary coded decimal instead of, IEEE, floating point. And your game would be really slow because your joystick decoder was so slow.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I really, with Cartoonist, I kind of, I had a really minimal impact on the Atari community, but I think 35 years too late, I'm going to do the big reveal. I think that I might have invented the world's fastest Atari Basic joystick decoder function. And I kind of had the idea that I was onto something back then, but I never dared send it into a magazine and write it up because maybe somebody else had already thought of it, and I feel stupid. But now, 35 years later, the internet's around, and I've looked around, and I've never seen anybody do it. And if you say, oh, no, everybody does that, then I can just say, well, who cares? It's 35 years later anyway. But anyway, what I did was I realized that the menu function on the tech could be adapted to the joystick function on the Atari. And so what I did is I looked at the joystick numbers, and the Atari Basic had this really unique feature that none of the other Basics had, where you could do a go to X or a go sub X, where X could be a variable, and on the Commodore PET and the Apple and all those other Microsoft Basics, you always had to have a number, but on Atari, it could be a variable. And so what I did is I'd say go sub stick 0, and the value that came out of stick 0 would be a line number, and then in each line number, I would put a, dx equals this, colon dy equals that return, and it would generate a go sub to that line number and decode the joystick, and I don't know if anybody else did it, but as far as I could tell, I was the only one that ever did that. And the interesting thing was that, over time, I saw these articles, people were trying to do joystick functions, and they finally said, let's just do it in machine language. And so there'd be these machine language routines, and you could type them in and call them, and they were a little bit faster, but it turned out that the basic routine was actually faster than the machine language routine because when you did all the fast decoding in machine language, you still had to turn it into binary coded decimal to get it back out. But if you did this Tektronix technique in BASIC, the Atari was unique because it did the line interpretation when you typed it in, and so the DX and DY were immediately encoded into BCD when you typed it in. So when you did your go sub, it never had to do the decoding into binary coded decimal, and the basic routine actually ran faster than any of the machine language routines I tested. So that is my big contribution to Atari community 35 years too late, unless somebody already did it. But anyway, you would be the guy that knows, because you're the guy that knows more Atari people than I do. But that was what I thought was my big innovation at the time.
No, I haven't heard of that particular technique, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Just it hasn't come across my desk.
But yeah, that's where I got it, and it's actually in Cartoonist. That's what I did all my other programs with, was using that technique, and it came from the Tektronix. It came from learning that those go-tos, you could vector them there, and the unique aspect of Atari Basic encoding when you typed it in, and then having a go sub X where X was a variable. So So, I started writing these little games, and the next one I wanted to do is I wanted to do Lunar Lander. I started getting all excited about player missile graphics, and I was reading about it, and it was like, oh man, player missile graphics, that's, it was like magic. It was like black magic as I started learning about that. So I decided I was going to do the world's best Lunar Lander in the Atari. And I wrote a little Lunar Lander in the electronics lab at school that was all character-based. And in fact, there used to be a text-based one. And it would say, you're 500 feet up, how much fuel to use, and you'd tell it, and then you'd always crash. But it was all text-based. But I wanted to write one on the Atari that was graphical, and I wanted to have it be better than the Tektronix one, and I wanted to have it have little jets and stuff. And so I'm doing all these player missile graphics, and I'm making all the little bit patterns and typing them in. It was like on a Saturday or something. I was just in a groove, and I was really cranking, and I've been working all day long, and all of a sudden the power went out to the entire house, and I had not done a single save all day long, and the screen went dim, and the program disappeared, and I go, oh my gosh, there went the Lunar Lander program. And so I went out back. I went looking around to try and figure out what happened, and two of my little brothers, David and Jonathan, they were a lot younger than me, they were standing out back. We had the master power box out behind our house, and they had just discovered that there was a big power switch on that thing, and they said, I wonder what happens if you throw this. And they had thrown it and shut off the power, and they are the ones who destroyed the world's best Atari Lunar Lander game, because I never got back to that. But the good thing that happened was that the good thing that happened is I started to look at that and think about, I want to have something like that, but I never want to, do that again. What can I do to save myself some effort in making these little movable graphics so I can do the player missile graphics? And that was where the idea behind Cartoonist kind of showed up, is I realized, maybe there's a way for me to make an editor where I can edit these animated graphics to do something. So I made this program called Animator that would make a little frame, and you could put some little dots in there and pixels and turn them on and off and edit them and then save them as a file, and it would convert them to, values that you could use in player missile graphics and make that. So I was still on this path of doing a Lunar Lander, but I had to make a multi-frame film editor first. And so I started working on that thing for a while and just consuming all the information on player missile graphics that I could. So about that time, I was graduating from high school, and I was heading off to college. I was going to go to BYU, and met my girlfriend, who's now my wife, Lisa. And and about that time, the APX. I heard about the APX program. There's this APX program, and if you write a cool program for it, maybe we'll give you $25,000 or something. And I was really motivated by that. And I was saying, this is what I'm going to do. I want to go write this really cool program and sell it to Atari, and then I'll be a video game designer, the rest of my life. And that was a real motivation, And so I wrote up Animator, and I sent it off to Atari, and they came back and said, well, this is pretty cool, and we like it, but the problem is you use the keyboard too much, and we really want something where we don't have to use the keyboard. We really like to have this be for people who can just use this with a joystick. It will sell a lot better. People like it a lot better. So we're going to reject it this time, but don't give up. So I said, well, okay. So let me start working on that. So about fall of 1982, I started doing my second version, which I actually decided to call Cartoonist. So I was working on that all of fall of 1982, and about that time I learned a little bit of machine language. I went and got Lance Leventhal's 6502 book, and there were some parts in that were just way too slow. And the thing was, I spent all my money buying an Atari. I had an Atari. I had an 810 disk drive. I had a cassette recorder, but I didn't really have much more money than that. And so I didn't feel like I could afford an assembler. So everything I put in there was hand-assembled, hand-compiled machine language. I'd look up in the book. I'd get the opcode. I'd convert it into decimal and test it out. And if there was no debugger, if it blew up, then it blew up. But that's what it was. And the only interesting thing about that, as I look back, is I had this one particular problem where I had this loop. When you're doing the animation, it has to go through this loop to do the animation and change the colors and move it around on the screen and stuff. And in Atari, in the 6502 instruction set, you can do a major jump. You can do a jump which gives you a 2-byte operand, but you can also do a branch, which is only 1 byte. And the branch you can do with relocatable code, but the jump isn't relocatable. And since I wanted to make this so it could run on any Atari, I couldn't count on memory being available in any particular place because part of it was in BASIC and that is in memory. So I had to do relocatable code, which meant the longest loop I could have was 127 bytes long because that was the
as far as you could jump
backward you could do was whatever. So I'm trying to write that main loop and it was 140 bytes, 38 bytes. I mean, I just couldn't get it down to 127, and I worked at it and finally I tried something, and the thing I tried was I made self-modifying code. I did to get it down to exactly 127. I found that I could save a few bytes if I had, in the middle of the loop, it actually modified some of the instructions that it was about to execute and then go through them and then save just enough bytes to do that loop. So the reason I bring that up is I was walking out of work, a few days ago, and somebody said, "So what's going on?" I said, "Well, nothing." And I said, "Well, actually," I said, "Kevin's going to interview me for this Atari thing I did like 35 years ago." And he's going, "Really? What are you going to talk about?" And I said, "Well, this one time I wrote this self-modifying code on the 6502. And he's going, "Oh, wow, I had a Commodore 64. And so I got like major street cred just for writing self-modifying code on the 6502. So, nice. that was my big thing was that loop. But anyway,
nice.
That's what it had. What's that?
You said something in your email that the people at Atari freaked out when they found out that.
Oh yeah,
Tell me about that.
So later, this is later in the story. But later, when they agreed to get Cartoonist, they said, "Okay, send us your source code. The basic and machine code. We want it all." And I said, I was dealing with John Cardoso. He was the guy at APX that was doing all this. And so he said, "Yeah, send us all your source code." And I said, "Well, I'll send you the basic code, but the thing you need to realize is this was all hand-compiled machine language." And he's going, "Really? Nobody does that." So they said, "Yeah, we'll take it." But they were kind of shocked that it was all hand-compiled. So anyway, but
nice.
So anyway. So I got Cartoonist done, and that was about fall of that was about December of 1982, and so I was dating Lisa at the time, and so forth, and so I sent it off to Atari, and I was a Mormon at the time. I'm a Methodist now, but at the time I was a Mormon, and so the thing, if you're a Mormon kid and you live in Utah and you're 19 years old, the thing you do is you go on a mission. And so, I sent off my papers and they said, "Well, you're going to Argentina." So they have a thing in Provo called the Missionary Training Center, which was about 2 blocks from my house, which, at any given time, at least back in 1983, they had about 2,000 people there at any given time, and if you were going to a place that spoke English, you were there for 2 weeks, and if you were going to a place that spoke Spanish, you were there for 8 weeks, so you could learn Spanish. So in March of 1983, I checked into that place, and I hadn't heard back from Atari, and I thought, who knows, whenever I'll hear back. So I checked in and started learning Spanish, and then kind of a really amazing sequence of events happened when you're in there. It's really kind of an isolated place. I mean, it's in the middle of the town. It's next to university, but they have you're supposed to leave everything behind, and you're really isolated from everybody. You can only write to your family, with letters. You can't call. You can't go visit.
Right.
It's kind of an isolating experience. You're spending all your time learning Spanish. You're immersed in language, and so one day I get this letter from my parents, and they say, Atari wants to buy Cartoonist. They're really excited about it, and so I was all excited, and then I get to the second part of the letter, and it says, but they want some changes to the program. And so it's like, okay, so I'm already off on this trajectory. I've got this commitment. I'm on my way. What do I do? And I didn't know what to do. And but the church leader at the time was a guy named Joe Christensen. He was the leader of all the missionaries there. So I went and got an appointment and went and talked to him and said, so I got this situation. I wrote this program on the Atari, and they want me to make some changes to it, but I'm off on my way to Argentina, and I just really don't see any way that this thing can work. And the other requirement they had, which I didn't realize initially, was that if Atari takes your program, if APX takes your program, you have to be able to support it, because if you have a bug in that program, they want you to be able to fix it so they can keep selling it.
Sure.
So the requirement was not only that it be fixed up to their spec and be, functional, but I had to have that computer for the duration of the time that they were selling it. And I had no plans to take that computer to Argentina. So I just couldn't see any way. And he made kind of an amazing decision. He said, well, how long do you think it'd take you to make the changes? And I said, well, maybe about a week, I think. And he says, well, why don't you just make the changes here? And I said, really? You'd let me do that? And he goes, yeah, why not? What do you need? I said, well, I need a big color TV, and I need a quiet place where I can be all alone, and I need all my books, and I need my equipment. And he said, okay, you can do it. So he let me call my parents on the phone, which I previously wasn't allowed to do. And I said, I'm coming over and have a cardboard box ready. So, I drove two blocks to my house and got a big cardboard box, and then went the Atari, and then went the 810, and then went my books, and then went my program manuals, and I'm wearing my suit, because you couldn't go anywhere without wearing your suit and your name tag,
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
it all went in the box and drove back to the mission, and they gave me this room, this old dorm room that nobody used, and they brought in a color TV, and for the next week, every day we'd get up, we'd put on our suits and stuff, and the rest of the guys would go to Spanish class, and I would head to this room. So I was probably the first and most likely the only person to do any kind of software development inside the MTC. That's where this thing got written, or at least the last part of it, the finishing touches got written. So I'm in there. I have this big Sony TV. I'm living the dream. This is going to be sold to Atari, and here I am. I have this special privilege because I'm working on a computer, and everybody else is just learning Spanish. And so this went on for about 2 days, two and a half days, and all of a sudden, because I had a week, it was from a Monday to a Friday. They were going to give me 1 week, and so on about Tuesday night, I'm working on a thing, and all of a sudden, the 810 died. It just died. Now, anybody that's ever had an 810, they were always a little bit flaky. And in fact, my 810, I actually had to send off to Atari one time. It stopped working, so I had to ship it back to Atari, and they held on to it for about a month. And they worked on it. They did some stuff, and they sent it back, and it was a little bit better. And it turned out what the deal was with these drives is they were a little bit flaky on the rotation rate. And what I learned over time is that if I could take a screwdriver, there was a little potentiometer on there, and I could, you know how they beep. You load it in every time you get 128 bytes or whatever, you get a little beep, and so it'd start rotating. I wouldn't hear any beeps, and then I'd adjust the potentiometer until the speed was just right, and it'd start beeping, and I knew it was set. And I'd leave it that way for a couple of weeks, and it would, then it would go out of whack again. But that's how it would always work. Well, suddenly nothing I did made this drive work, and there I was. I'm in the middle of the MTC. I couldn't go anywhere. I didn't know anybody. It's not like I could just, grab a backpack and start roaming places. I thought, this is toast. This is not going to go anywhere. My chance of glory is gone. and I was just trying to contemplate what to do. And finally, I'd been going to all the missionary classes, and I did the thing that they taught us to do. I knelt down on the floor, and I grabbed my 810 drive, and I prayed that God would fix my drive. And it's strange, but that's what I did. And looking back, that was an amazing thing. There's this story I came across later, much later in my life. There was this guy named back in the 1400s, 1500s, and he got all excited about God, and he was going to go off and be a monk. And he shows up in the monastery, and they accepted him, and then they said, well, actually, we don't need so many monks. What we need is a cook. And so they made him the cook. And he had this little prayer he'd say, and his prayer was, Lord of all the pots and pans and things, make me a saint by serving up the dishes and cleaning up the plates. And so I, thinking back, it was like, I was praying to the God of Atari peripherals and things that he would fix my drive. And so I was just as sincere as I could be. And I stood back up and plugged it back in and turned it on, and it was still broken, And it's like, okay, that didn't work. And I didn't know what I was going to do. But I talked to a couple of people, and somebody put me in touch with, an Atari store. There was a new Atari store. I knew there was one that I had some relationships with, but they didn't do any repairs. But there was a new one that showed up, and they put me in touch with this store, somebody I'd never met. There was a guy named Tim, and he had some kind of electronics experience. And I said, look, I'm a missionary. I'm going to Argentina. I'm writing this software. They're letting me do it for APX. And my drive just died. And I've got a week to do it, and I'm on day 3, and the drive's dead. And he said, I'll help you out. I'll take care of it. So he came up, he got my drive, and he went back and basically rebuilt the thing. I don't know what he did, but he rebuilt the thing, brought it back the next day, and it was functional, and he didn't bill me a dime. So I got 24-hour service, probably the first and last anybody ever got. I got a rock-solid drive, and with the remaining 2 days, I did a little bit more machine language. I modified the program a little bit. Cartoonist, I had character set stuff going on in there. I had player missile graphics. I had, some sound. I had character sets. I had machine language. I had all this stuff in there. Somehow, in that week, I finished it up, and using that drive, I burned the gold copy master disc and stuck it in a manila envelope and sent it off to Atari.
Wow.
To John Cardoso. And that's just always been the most amazing thing to me, because at that time it looked like it was never going to go anywhere. But everybody that has a copy of Cartoonist got it burned on that drive that Tim fixed for me, that I believe was an answer to that prayer. So anyway, I was excited, so that was done, and I went back to class, and my parents said, okay, you're going to Argentina. And the thing is, I didn't know anything about Argentina, but I do know.
Did you manage to learn any Spanish that week?
Oh yeah, I didn't learn any Spanish at all that week. So I was behind 1 week out of 8, but okay. I quickly caught up. But all I did the entire week was work on that software, and I would be willing to bet that I was probably the only guy that ever wrote software and shipped it from that place ever.
Yeah, that's probably a good bet. Yeah.
It's just not done. It was just so unusual that they even let me do that. But because you're supposed to leave stuff behind. But that's where the gold copy was burned, was in some nondescript room in the middle of that complex. Sometime in early March 1983, and. So the next thing was, how do we get this thing to Argentina? And they have 50 hertz power down there, and it's all PAL. It's not NTSC. And my parents went and got a special suitcase, and they had a furniture factory custom make something to hold the 810 drive, we could only take 2 suitcases, so I had to clean out my suitcases of a lot of stuff to make room for carrying this Atari down there. And so...
and you're bringing the Atari in order to be able to do support from down there?
To be able to do support, right. Just in case something went wrong, I had to have an Atari with me so that I could support APX. That was the contract, And so I had all these regular suitcases, and then I had all these extra suitcases, and I had the 800, and I had the 810, and I had the 410, and I had the manuals, and I had the extra floppies, because I think this was probably the first Atari to ever go into Argentina. They weren't selling down there. I know they were selling a lot of stuff in Germany, but I was probably the first person to take one down there. So got on a plane, went to Argentina, and I showed up I was going to Cordoba, Argentina. That was where, I was assigned. And so I show up at the mission office in May of 1983, and they were supposed to be pre-coordinating, but they hadn't. So everybody shows up, and they meet the new church leaders and stuff, and it's like, here's me and my Atari. So I was thinking that I was going to revolutionize proselyting with this Atari 800 computer. There had to be some special reason, but it turned out that was not the case. What happened is they said, we're going to be moving you all over the place, and you're going to be living in places where people are, and there's really not that good security on coming in and out of the homes. And tell you what, why don't you just leave that thing here in the main office? And so they gave me a special shelf in the main office, and I stuck the equipment there, and it sat there. And every time I'd come to visit, I'd go peek at it and check it out, and it was still there. And it was, but it mainly sat there the whole time. Nothing went wrong. The software worked. There was never anything that broke. It just worked. And the computer basically sat there. I moved all over the country, but it just sat there the whole time, except for one day. There was one day when I was assigned to work in the mission office, and there was somebody from the United States who came down. It was an engineer living down there, and he had an NTSC TV. And we found out that he had an NTSC TV, and I said, I've got this Atari. How about if we come bring that over to your house and try it out on your TV and see if it works? And he goes, okay, but tell you what, we'll feed you barbecue dinner, so so we were all excited because first this guy was going to feed us a barbecue dinner, and then second we were going to try out the Atari. And so we go over there and we're thinking we're going to get hamburgers or something. But Argentina is really famous for all their beef, and I guess they this family down there, and they said we're going to do something really special for these guys. And so in downtown Cordoba, it's a city of like 1 million people or so, they have this great big meat market downtown. You can go down there. I mean, here, if you go to the store and you want a steak, they have a nice plastic wrap steak, and you buy it and you leave. But down there, they'll have a cow hanging on the counter, and you say, "Give me a steak." The butcher will pull out a knife and cut you off a slab and say, "Here you go." And if you say, "I want a hamburger," he'll cut off a slab and he'll drop it in a grinder and grind it up and then give it to you. But anyway, they went down and I guess they bought all these weird meat parts. There's unusual meats, and they were very delicious, but nothing that we ate we recognized, but it was very delicious. And then it was like, okay, let's go set up the Atari. So we went and set it up, and we got out Cartoonist and showed them how that worked, and did a couple of animations and things, and then they looked over in my case and they said, "Hey, is that Star Raiders over there?" And I'm going, "Yeah," because you can't go anywhere with an Atari without bringing Star Raiders, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I brought that, and I had basketball, and so here's this strange view. Here's all these missionaries, and we're playing basketball, and having this strange meat dinner, and I mean that was the use of the Atari 800 in Argentina, was that one day.
Wow.
But anyway, it worked.
Nice.
And I was glad there were no problems. But had there been a problem, that that would have been the use. And so
I just want to interject here. I have a family member who is Mormon, and so we take her to church, and we have met many missionaries and had them over to dinner and that sort of thing. And I don't know what the rules were then, but the rules are now. I mean, they get access to no technology. They can't bring iPads and stuff, and then they are issued iPads in which they are allowed to use like the LDS app, and they can go to the Mormon website and look things up there.
Right.
And that's it. I mean, you can't even go to Google and
Oh yeah. Yeah, I didn't have a phone, and we couldn't carry phones, and even now, and if we needed to make a phone call in Argentina, I mean, it was way behind the times. You'd go down to the phone company, and they'd have some booths, and you'd rent a booth, and you'd make your calls from the phone company to wherever you need to call. But yeah, there was all these restrictions. So the fact that they let me take a computer down there was just so far out of the normal, and playing video games, that was also out of the normal. It wasn't prohibited because nobody knew that it could be done, because nobody took computers, right? But anyway, I took this one, and that one day we played some games. And while I was down there, that's when I found out that I won the Atari Star Award in fall of 1983 for Cartoonist. They gave it to me in the systems category, so that was really exciting.
Yes, first prize in the systems telecommunication category. Want to know about that?
Yeah, I couldn't believe it. I was so excited. I was living in a city called Villa Maria, which was way out in the Pampas, and it took letters like 6 weeks to get to me from the United States. I was so far out, but that's where I found out. I was living on some nondescript street out in Villa Maria, and all of a sudden I get this letter says, "You won the Atari Star Award for fall of '83, or at least the first place telecommunications Atari Store." But I was just really excited about that.
That's
that was
awesome.
Really amazing.
Now, traditionally, you would get a stipend where you could buy Atari gear with that. Did you get to?
Yeah, so they did. They said, "What do you want? Here's the catalog." And so I sent them a letter back, and so I think we got a letter quality printer, and we got some games, and I got a modem, and an extra disk drive. I got a 1050 disk drive, and my little brothers, I think they went and got another Atari or something while I was gone. But anyway, somehow a bunch of equipment showed up from Atari, and that's what I got. But that was really exciting, and so I eventually got back. I got back in about the fall of September 1984, and by that time, I guess there'd been some kind of video game market crash, and APX stopped selling the software, and sales were going up. I'd get a couple $100 every once in a while, and it wasn't a big seller, but I get a couple $100 every once in a while, and then they stopped selling it, and then Attic bought it, and then I got a few $100 for another few quarters, and then it kind of stopped, But it was just fun. It was just fun to be part of the APX community and send that software in. It was just really a privilege to have that whole experience.
Sounds like you had a truly unique experience.
Yeah, it really was.
Yeah.
It really was. As I think back, I mean, here we are having this conversation. We would have never had it. So that whole thing was just, it was just amazing to take that there. And so anyway, I went back to school. I went to electrical engineering. I guess because I did that, they gave me a little note. I was like one of the 7 unique electrical engineering students to ever, go to BYU because I did this thing with the Atari. They gave me a couple of lines in the book, but the fun thing, I only have a few extra stories, but the other fun thing that happened was the printer. They gave me this letter quality printer, and that was like the cheapest letter quality printer you could get at the time. And it was a little 5-character per second thing. I'm sure you're familiar with it. I don't remember the model number.
1020. I think you said the 1027. I think.
Yeah, the 1027, and I used that all the way through college. I wrote all my reports on Atari Writer, and used that printer all the way through until I was taking this history of physics class, and this was I called this the incident of the last minute printing of the physics final report. So I'd stayed up all night writing this report, and the Atari had this really funny bug in the operating system, which I learned later manifested itself in the disk drive and in the printer. And sometimes you'd be loading, particularly on the 810, you'd be loading a piece of software, the disk would be beeping along, and it would just stop for a few seconds and think for itself, for a little while, and then start back up and keep going, Well, on the printer, it had that same bug. It was the same I/O software in the OS that was controlling the printer, but sometimes the printer would just be chattering along at 5 characters per second, which was really slow anyway, but sometimes it would just stop, and it would wait for exactly 256 seconds, and then it would start back up. And it didn't happen very often, but it happened often enough that I finally timed it and found out it was exactly 256 seconds, and I knew it was the OS. And so here it is. I'd been up all night writing this report, and I'm getting ready to print it out, and it was like due at noon, and so I started printing it out at like 9 in the morning, and here it's chugging along at 5 characters per second, and it was like a 20-page, report, and it's going along. And it seemed like that particular day there was a huge preponderance of the 256-second delay bug, And so this is just dragging out, and it's dragging out, and it's getting closer and closer to class time, and I had to get this thing in, and it's getting closer and closer to class time, and I'm starting to panic, and I finally get to the last page, and it's on that page it decided to have that problem like 4 times, and it's really getting close to 12 o'clock, and finally what I did, it got down to the last line, and on the very last line of the report, it stopped one more time, and I went through the house, and I opened all the doors, and I went out in my car, and I started the engine, and I opened the door, and I put my binder with the report there, all open with all the other pages except this one, and I sat there and waited for 256 seconds until it finally printed the last page. And then I ran through all the open doors and didn't close them and jumped in the car and sped all the way to school and ran up the steps and handed in and barely made it by 12. But that was the last time I used Atari Writer to write a report. And looking back, that was kind of fun to have the OS have these little idiosyncrasies and bugs. One of the fun things I did also is I just really enjoyed the player missile graphics and the sound. I kind of miss. I mean, I've got a nice computer nowadays. I bought a Next later, and I have a Mac now, and they're faster and they have more memory and stuff. But I just miss being so close to the OS. You type a sound command and sound's coming out. You type a graphics command and graphics coming out. You type a stick command and you got input from the joystick. I just miss being that close and all the things you could do. There was this one time. I used Cartoonist. I was dating Lisa, and for Valentine's Day, I wanted to make her a special Valentine card. So since I'm a nerd, I wrote a computer program, and I did a custom character set, and I used Cartoonist to make player missile graphics, and then I made myself a sound editor. I used to play the piano a lot. I still play a little bit, but I used to know these big concertos. And so I did this four voice piano piece for this concerto, and hand-coded in all the tones, and I did a character set that had a stage, and I did Cartoonist to have this guy, and he'd walk out on the stage, and then he'd sit down, and he'd play this music that I knew how to play, and then it was, it's with the character set and the player missile graphics and the sound, and then there was like, hey, will you go out on a date with me, or something like that, anyway, it was very nerdy, but I used all the Atari skills I had to catch this girl, so she did go out on a date with me.
Despite or because of your prowess of the computer?
Probably despite. She was very kind, and but we eventually got married. But yeah, she knew I was an Atari enthusiast, and I'm very much an Atari enthusiast. I mean, one other story I can tell was, many years later, I was at work. I was working with this group of developers, and this was long past the days. I still had my next computer, which was really old, by then, and we were all kind of competitive. And every time somebody get a new computer, they would say, "Hey, I got a new computer. You guys all have slow ones, or whatever." So there was this one guy named Dwayne, and he was giving me a hard time about my next computer being only 25 megahertz, and he had this brand new Mac that was gigahertz or something, and had this friend Jeff watching this interchange, and so we're going back and forth about which computer's better, and my CPU was slower and so on. And I knew that this guy Dwayne had this Nova game that he liked to play on his Mac, where he had all these galaxies and you'd go around and take over stars and star systems and stuff. And finally, I said to him, "Well, you're making fun of my old computer, but let me tell you something. I have an Atari 800, and it has a game like Nova. It's called Star Raiders, except it's in 3D. and he was so stunned by that statement that his mouth went up and down, and nothing came out of it. And my other friend Jeff, who saw that, for 15 years after, as we get together occasionally, I don't see him much anymore, but we get together occasionally, and we'll start talking about the good old times. He always brings up the time that my Atari 800 outclassed a Mac to defend the next. So I'm an enthusiast, but the Atari I eventually bought. Well, actually, I'm moving ahead, but the last thing I did with my Atari in school was for my senior project. We needed to do something that involved hardware and software, so I went and bought an Atari 800 XL, and Lisa and I actually did this together. She's a double E, and so I wrote some machine language, and we made an infrared wireless communication link between two Atari computers. It would go at about 1200 baud, and it could go across 10 feet, and we built transmitter and receivers, and you could sit and type on one computer, and it would show up on the other screen and go back and forth. And that was our senior project. But that was the last physical thing that I did with really my Atari. I still have it, but it's kind of in a box. But the one thing I realized after I agreed to kind of talk to you on this interview is it actually had a huge influence on my PhD dissertation. I hadn't realized that until we agreed to have this conversation, and I started, thinking about it. But I did a dissertation I did a PhD dissertation in high-speed data compression, and I was spending all this time working on these data compression algorithms, vector quantization at the school. We had little microvacs, and they were just slow. And spending all my time looking at all these slow algorithms. And one day, all of a sudden, I realized there was a really fast way to do it using a hierarchical set of lookup tables. And so I did my whole dissertation around these hierarchical lookup tables and how you could do fast compression, and it was really complex. I actually wrote my own computer language just so that I could implement the algorithm I had in mind. It was that complex, and I've never published the computer language itself, but it was, I had all these complex data structures. But looking back, the thing I realized is when I was programming the Atari, this is something they don't teach in school, but there was a lot of table stuff going on. There was the lookup table for the joysticks. When you're doing the player missile graphics, you have these tables where you're copying the data into the player and it's moving them around. You had the tables when you're drawing on the screen. You weren't drawing with colors. You were drawing with indexes into color tables, and you change the color table, and suddenly the color changes all over the screen. And so I didn't get this in school, but working with the Atari, I got this familiarity with the use of lookup tables for high-performance computing. And suddenly I realized that the reason I was able to come up with that concept was because of my Atari. Because of all that time I spent programming the Atari, it gave me this idea that later became, my PhD. Now, I didn't get a PhD. They didn't award it. They had a little integrity problem after I wrote my dissertation, so it was not awarded. But that aside, the entire idea for my dissertation, I think, came from my Atari work. And so I think, looking back, it was just a tremendously rewarding experience to, work to get that Atari and work in a diamond factory and then learn how to program it and just do all the fun things with it. And it's just the coolest thing in the world that we're having this conversation. I'm talking to the Atari guy that's probably talked to more Atari guys than anybody I know. It's just only good memories of that machine.
Oh, I'm so glad it was a positive experience for you. That's awesome.
Yep. So that's my story.
Nice.
If you have any questions, I mean, I'd like to ask you some questions, but
Sure.
what do you want?
I have a couple questions for you.
Sure.
Did you ever get any feedback from users? Any letters or phone calls or anything?
I never did.
No? Huh.
No, nobody ever wrote to me, or actually, I think I maybe got one feedback from one person, and I don't remember what it was, but at most it was one person. But I never really heard from anybody. I mean, the internet didn't exist. I didn't have, an email address, or there wasn't really a mechanism.
Question 2 is that you said you still have your Atari in a box somewhere, and so I
do.
Questions regarding that. Do you have any of your discs? Do you have any of the software, maybe stuff that wasn't released or anything?
I have all my discs. I have everything.
Wow.
I even bought I bought a special interface to move it, and I have never moved all my stuff onto another computer, but I would love to do it.
Let's do that. I have that. I have the equipment to do it. If you
do, you really?
Yes, I do, and I would love to borrow those discs, and because I want to see the stuff that wasn't released. And there
was tons of stuff. I mean, I did my own character set editor. I have tons of stuff on there. So yeah, let's coordinate and
Excellent.
Get some of this stuff out there.
Excellent. Oh, that's awesome. And my other question is, do you have me and some other folks have been working for years to archive all of the Atari Program Exchange stuff, all the software, all the manuals and everything. And the Cartoonist manual is one of the ones that has fallen through the cracks. No one has a copy of it. Do you?
I do.
Excellent.
I don't know which disc it's on, but it's definitely, it should be on the master. Oh no, I think the only thing that's there is I think they just have the basic program. That's right. They didn't include. No, I have it in Atari Writer on one of my discs. I do have that manual.
Well, that's something. I meant the printed manual that they shipped. But
actually, I think I do, because one of my brothers actually went out and bought Cartoonist at the store somewhere. He saw it and bought it and gave it to me, and I think it has a user manual included. But I'm sure we can. I'm sure we can work that out. I have a whole box with my Atari stuff. I haven't opened it for years, but I'm sure I would have that.
Excellent. All right, that's exciting.
I would have the original.
All right, well, I know you came into this with you made a list of stories, and that's awesome. Normally, I would ask what haven't we talked about that we should have, but I bet that we covered everything.
I wrote every story I knew that I could think of. There's probably a couple more, but I sat down for a couple of weeks and wrote down at least the summary of every story I could think of. And probably if I could look at my discs, I could probably tell you a couple dozen more, because I had a lot of cool things going on with that.
Sure. If you could send a message to the Atari computer users that still exist and who are listening to this podcast, and you can send them a message right now, what would you tell them?
The thing I would tell the Atari users is, I think this is a priceless machine. As I thought about this experience of using the Atari, I have a nephew who is going into engineering, or I actually have a number of nephews who would like to learn programming, and I've suddenly realized that there is no easy way to learn programming on a computer nowadays. I mean, there's books and there's games and stuff, but in the days of the Atari, I could write a game on my computer that was competitive with almost the best of anything that could be out there. And nowadays, if you're a kid trying to learn how to program, no matter what you make, it's going to fall far below whatever you can go buy at the store for $20. And so to the users, I would say cherish the time that you spend having a computer that puts you with the best technology that was available at the time, and don't lose the imagination that went along with that. When I think back even pre-Atari to the time when I'm playing this rotten game with the risk game that didn't do the energy checking and all those things, there was a lot of imagination that we had to put into the games that compensated for the lack of graphics and all those other things. And I think the Atari community has tons of imagination that kind of isn't really replicated. Even our computers are higher resolution and sounds better and everything's better and more pixels, but hang on to your imagination that you nourished using this computer, and don't ever lose that. That would be my message. Hang on to that imagination, because we need it, all of us.
Awesome. What do you do today?
So my wife and I have a small business, and we do research in contract programming. So we have a couple of clients, and do do prototyping and stuff. Every once in a while, I'll publish a paper. I published. We did a little iPhone app. It was just a little prototype iPhone app back in 2012, 2013. I wrote an IEEE paper on it on how to. It was on disaster response. In the case of a disaster, how to get data out to an iPhone to help first responders. So that paper is called Fast-Responder. You can look it up in IEEE. But we do signal processing and prototyping and a little bit of R&D. Just a little small company.
Thanks. I think I have what I need, Bryan. Thank you.
Hey, you take care.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute, there are two ways you can help. You can help fund these interviews directly by contributing to my Patreon. A small monthly contribution will help offset the expenses of making these oral history interviews. Contribute at patreon.com/Savitz. Or make a tax-deductible contribution to the Internet Archive, a nonprofit digital library that has done incredible things to preserve computer history. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thanks.